There's a dramatic video online right now that is going viral showing a little boy in Syria running away from sniper fire in Syria from the Assad regime and saving his little sister. Now this video has galvanized millions of views. A large number of publications are talking about this, and they're using it as a way to vilify Assad and to show how ruthless the Assad regime really is. Well, surprise, 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 everything here that you just saw and everything I just said was a total and absolute lie. This is the little boy. He's a paid actor. That's the little girl. She's a paid actor too. This is the film crew that works for the Norwegian Film Institute that gets their money from the Norwegian government that is a part of NATO. They got $30,000 from the Norwegian government, a part of NATO, to make this propaganda film. If you don't believe me, here's another shot of them actually filming it as it was happening. Here's the camera guy. Here's the audio guy filming this fake viral video that has galvanized international coverage. The US State Department even tweeted it out. They haven't redacted it. The New York Daily News, the Telegraph, right-wing news, of course they're going to use this as a way to justify more intervention. The Independent, they still have the article and the video up as if it was true.
Turn the right way. North. الله أكبر الله أكبر ما تصبي ما تصبي لا حول الله ما تصبي عم يتحرك رقم مش عم يتحرك ليش يتحرك الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر ما مات فيه لك طلع فينا الله أكبر إيه هربوا لا حول الله أكبر إلا بالله الله أكبر شباب شلون إيه ما مات شفتوه إيه والله هرب الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر ما تصبي ما تصبي لا حول الله ما تصبي عم يتحرك رقم مش عم يتحرك ليش يتحرك الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر ما مات فيه لك طلع فينا الله أكبر إيه هربوا لا حول الله أكبر إلا بالله الله أكبر شباب شلون إيه ما مات شفتوه إيه والله هرب.
Stunning fakery in the alleged chemical weapons attack, according to a former UK ambassador. Coming up.
The British Broadcasting Corporation is accused of staging chemical weapons attack. The CIA admits planting CNN reporters. And international lawyers call for journalists inciting violence to be expelled.
August 2013, and NATO leaders can't get the public on side for the imminent bombing of Syria. Suddenly, the BBC says it was filming a small rural hospital, and a game-changing atrocity happens right there, the moment they were filming.
We were filming the doctors working at this hospital when victims of an incendiary bomb attack on a school playground started pouring in.
Absolute chaos and carnage here. It must be some sort of napalm.
But a highly skeptical public stayed hostile to military intervention. Exactly 1 month later, the leaders are trying to pin a chemical weapons attack on Syria without success. The BBC airs exactly the same footage but digitally alters the word napalm for, quote, chemical weapons, hoping no one will notice.
Absolute chaos and carnage here. It must be some sort of chemical weapon.
Not only did folks notice, but it unleashed a massive public investigation, which made some extremely disturbing findings.
This is the total fabrication. From beginning to end of an atrocity with BBC reporter Ian Pannell standing amidst a tableau of very bad actors. This is completely beyond the pale.
This audio analysis by media investigator Robin Upton shows both versions are identical and from the same speech. The BBC then digitally altered the words from napalm to chemical weapon, the exact justification NATO was finding difficult to prove. That game-changing allegation was made by two doctors that had travelled with the BBC, who claimed the number of sudden casualties is, quote, overwhelming. What kind of doctor, notes media investigator Robert Stewart, gives interviews when she is surrounded by supposedly seriously burned and dying teenagers?
Get anyone who isn't a patient out of here.
When a nurse does finally start to help, her order to get anyone who isn't a patient out of here doesn't apply to the cameramen. Even worse, notes Stewart, is the bizarre acting which starts when the man in the center gives the sign.
What do you need to see? We're just human beings. We want to live, you know? Isn't it our right to live?
Dr. Roller, on whose sole claim the BBC sends napalm chemical weapons allegations around the world, is actually the daughter of Syrian rebel Musa al-Qadi. The parallel to the Gulf War and nurse Naira is stunning. Congressman said the nurse's tearful testimony that Iraqis were killing children swung their vote in favor of war.
Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
Nurse Naira became the mainstream's darling, but once the vote had safely passed, she admitted inventing the whole thing and was actually the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to Washington, lying to get the public to back war. UK Member of Parliament George Galloway joins us. Thank you very much for coming on. Why do we get almost identical claims before each war, which then prove lies?
Well, the Bush and Blair Corporation, as it became in the run-up to the Iraq War, has almost entirely lost its reputation for journalistic integrity. A full inquiry must be launched into why the BBC used a piece of material which was not just wrong, but was falsified, and falsified with the purpose of propelling our country into war. That's not what the British public pays its BBC license fee for, so that it can be tricked into a war.
In a statement, the British Broadcasting Corporation says it stands by its report. The Syrian opposition denies the allegations. Investigators such as Robert Stewart note there are many questions sent officially to the corporation remain unanswered. There are also numerous such precedents, both in this war and previous invasions. Brilliant is how a top Western official called tricking the public through routine faking of atrocities and commonly aired on mainstream bulletins. Nightly news shows just a few cases of what happened next after mainstream cameras ended their reports.
It shows people putting on, fake wounds. It shows there's some guys there. Look, there's their head wounds. Peace, everybody. We're doing the right thing. We're creating fake propaganda. I mean, it's not even real atrocities. So they're there lined up. There was another video. It shows some guy kicking his leg and with a fake blood wound. Here's a guy who wakes up from his funeral. Watch this. They're reading. Oh, there. Oh, wait. There. Oh, he's awake. He's not even really dead. And so, I mean, this is just crazy what goes on. There was another video that was shot of a supposed massacre, and it cuts. You don't see the whole thing. When you go to the Al Jazeera footage, it shows real quick clips of a guy kicking his leg, and he's got blood coming out, which turned out to be fake blood.
The so-called activists behind the fakes are by far the most popular source, despite them never being verified and regularly disproved as fabrications to justify more NATO arms. The term activist may sound like a well-meaning Western campaigner or charity, but the Foreign Policy Journal notes it's just newspeak for insurgents. The official source on Syria casualties, or what mainstream claims is official, is impressive-sounding organization the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Reuters exposed the fact 3 years ago it was not an organization at all, or even working in Syria. It's a single pro-insurgent supporter living in Coventry, England. Here pictured at the Foreign Office after instructions from Britain's Foreign Minister himself.
You don't like BBC?
BBC كله.
Why?
سيء. لا يعني BBC سيء.
Because you are talking very bad about Syria.
You are not telling the truth
But you know
about Syria.
what? This is but this is the first time I've been able to come to Syria.
No, why
My
before you
first
didn't
visa.
come? Why before you didn't come?
I didn't have a visa.
No, why you didn't get the visa?
We've been waiting for a visa to
No,
come to tell
no,
your
it's not
story.
correct. Everybody can come to Syria and get visa.
It's not true. Fadi is here. We can ask Fadi.
No, no, it's not correct.
Well, there's no journalists
No,
who come
no,
to
no,
Syria.
no, no, no.
Well, tell me what your
You are
story
right.
is then. What do you think? What is? Tell me what
Okay,
the.
finish.
No, but tell me what you think is. What is the lie that's being told? What do you think is not
You
being
lie
told?
because you are talking truth, not truth about the Syria.
So
Syria
what is
is
the
very
truth?
quiet.
What is
The truth is that nothing we have in Syria. Syria is very quiet. And everybody in population in Syria loves our president, and we support the president. But you are talking the very lie about Syria.
Well, I didn't lie. It's my first day here.
No, you are lying because everybody here, population 23 million person from Syria, love Bashar al-Assad and support Bashar al-Assad.
But I'm not making it up. There are pictures of
No,
protests.
you are.
But there are pictures.
Your advertisement like that.
But if we see, yes,
No,
there
no,
are
no,
people
no,
like
no,
you
no.
who
You are
support-
liking. You are telling like that.
Well,
Everybody when BBC Arabic, he can hear the lie about Syria, Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya.
But what is it? But maybe Syria is like any country. Some people support and some
No,
people
no.
don't
Everybody
support.
has support.
So Syria is
And
different.
there is very little people. Maybe 10,000 like that. But the most of people, 22 million, 23 million person support Bashar al-Assad.
But even the
and we have not demonstration. We have armed gangs.
But even the president said there needs to be some change.
No, yes.
He did say that.
Change.
Yes. He said there are some legitimate grievances.
He is always doing to make that change.
Yes.
He's trying always to make this change. So is it we support him? But you are telling the lie about the Syria. Now finish.
Mr. Bashar Assad for very good and very kill.
But you have to know,
very good, and I like
Just I want to tell you something. Now you are representing the BBC, yes? You have to know you are working in BBC and all people that they are working in Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, that everybody in Syria, population of Syria, they know, pretty sure that you are lying. This is the most important.
While Syria is still locked in bloody confrontation on the ground, another war is also being waged, the media one. And as RT has discovered, even the world's most respected media outlets who have huge influence in shaping public opinion resort to distorting facts. Laura Smith is in London for us.
Escaped journalist speaks out, says the headline in the BBC. On The Guardian, Syrian regime TV reporter defects. They're talking about Hatan Slaber, who claims he was a reporter at 2 Syrian state-owned TV channels, but couldn't bear to be a part of the propaganda machine anymore, and after spying for the rebels for months, eventually defected to Turkey. But the Syrian news channel, or Al Akhbariya, says he's nothing but a fantasist.
Hatan Slaber's claims that he used to work as a correspondent at the Syrian news channel have nothing to do with reality. It's a lie. He applied a year and a half ago, but the channel didn't find him qualified for the job.
Sources from Al Dunya, the other TV station Slaber claims to have worked for, also confirmed he never had. Nevertheless, The Guardian and BBC have jumped on the story as the first example of, quote, a high-profile defector from Damascus's powerful propaganda arm. But as an actual anchor from Al Akhbariya pointed out when we spoke to him, if Slaber really was a public figure, it wouldn't have been hard to verify his credentials.
I saw his profile on Facebook and was shocked to discover it says he works for our channel. There are lots of ways to check this. Each of us has an ID of a journalist employed by the Syrian news channel that we can use to confirm our identity and employment. If it comes to that, we have our stories and materials to prove that too. Each journalist accumulates some materials in the process, especially if they worked at the Syrian news channel.
The British media has used Slaber to tell a story of a propaganda machine in Syria that pumps out a pro-government message regardless of the truth. Meanwhile, the BBC and The Guardian appear to be sticking like glue to their own line. Assad equals bad, rebels equal freedom fighters. Slaber himself now says he wants to work for an opposition channel. He told The Guardian he met someone from Al Jazeera who called him a government spy with a psychological problem. Perhaps that's closer to the truth than the British media got.
Our top story now. Syria's turmoil has been laid bare on our TV screens for more than a year. But some networks are being accused of affecting rather than reflecting the conflict. Maria Fanoshina reports now on how there's more to the coverage on the Qatari-owned Al Jazeera TV channel than meets the eye.
Clashes in the streets of Syria have been raging for a year now, but behind the scenes there is a media war that's just as damaging as the one taking Syrian lives. Rafiq Lotf, freelance investigative journalist from Damascus, says he's found what he thinks is proof of media manipulation of the conflict in Syria. In this video from the Syrian town of Homs, the camera focuses on the city's oil refinery. The shooting begins 7 hours before media viewers around the world see a pipeline explosion allegedly caused by Assad's army bombardment. You can clearly see that something is slowly burning in the distance. When the smoke has thickened, English speakers correct the camera's position for a better shot of what's going on. They shake it to make it look like amateur video.
I know this video is on the Al Jazeera server. It's clear it's not an explosion, but they ignore that and keep on reporting it the way they need to see it.
In another video from a hospital in Homs, someone behind camera talks to a doctor. In the corner, we see little Nakham.
When you are on air, you should tell Bashar God will punish you and then talk about his wife, okay? Let's rehearsal again.
After some 30 minutes of waiting, the crew starts to get nervous.
Let's call Al Arabiya, maybe. For how long can we wait?
No, we need Al Jazeera.
While live on Al Jazeera eventually, the girl will forget some details.
God punish you, Bashar, and your children.
In this footage, we see Danny, a Homs activist known for his exclusive reports from the very epicenter of the conflict. He's preparing to go live on CNN, and there is no shooting until he asks for it.
What shall I say?
Tell them there are some buildings collapsed and we're taking bodies away.
You say there could be as many as 200 dead just in the last hour or two? We have 200 dead in the last 3 hours. In the first half an hour, we've got 40 dead. In the first half an hour. And we got the video up on YouTube.
The activists who become journalists try to make their shows as hard as possible. The more blood and death, the higher the price.
But not everyone is happy about it. Well-known war correspondent Ali Hashem used to report for Al Jazeera from the world's conflict hotspots, but Syria has become the Rubicon he couldn't cross. He mentioned armed groups fighting against Assad's army, and his bosses in Doha told him he needed a vacation. Ali has just resigned because of biased coverage, he says.
Some were like, promoting the revolutions in Libya, Syria, Egypt, Tunisia, whatever, and dumping, for example, the revolution in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia.
The Al Jazeera chief in Beirut, where Ali has been working, has also quit for same reason.
We started to invite guests from America who only criticize the regime in Syria and support the regime in Bahrain, and persons who justify NATO intervention. This is unacceptable.
The media in this is just a proxy. It's a proxy used by external factors, by external factions, by external governments, by maybe the West, whoever, to fuel these wars.
With more and more proof emerging of the international media's involvement in the Arab Spring revolutions, the question remains open. To what extent do they influence events, and how much responsibility do they therefore share for what follows? Maria Fanoshina, RT, Beirut, Lebanon.
In this video, we're going to show you evidence that the Syrian government was framed in the chemical weapons attack of August 21st, 2013. We're going to explain why they were framed, and we're going to propose a course of action. The use of chemical weapons on civilians in the Syrian conflict was a crime against humanity. As such, it should be the subject of a real criminal investigation, and those responsible should be brought to justice. However, if the US and NATO have their way, that's not going to happen. In their book, a simple accusation is as good as a conviction, and therefore there's no point providing any real evidence. Let's just skip right to the missile strikes, shall we? This isn't really surprising to anyone who's been paying attention, though. The United States has had Syria and Iran in their crosshairs for a long time. The plans for these wars have been in the works for over a decade.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the joint staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, we've made the decision we're going to war with Iraq. This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, we're going to war with Iraq. Why? He said, I don't know. He said, I guess they don't know what else to do. So I said, well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda? He said, no. He says, there's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq. He said, I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments. And he said, I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail. So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? And he said, oh, it's worse than that. He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
There are 3 primary psychological techniques that the powers that be in any given era use to build up the public support needed to take a country to war. 1. Create the impression that the aggressor is actually acting in self-defense, or in defense of a helpless nation. This can be done by exaggerating the danger posed by an enemy, fabricating an attack and blaming it on the enemy, or intentionally provoking the enemy into a response. 2. Build up a crusade mythology, one that presents the aggressors as fighting for a higher ideal, or for the good of all humanity. In our current era, the meme of spreading democracy, fighting terrorism, or defending human rights are the most commonly used. 3. Dehumanize the enemy. War is mass murder. Therefore, presenting the enemy as evil, barbaric, or subhuman is essential unless you want your citizens and your soldiers questioning the morality of their actions. This pattern is often supported and augmented by a sense of cultural or racial superiority. The way Islamophobia is capitalized on to build moral support for this phony war on terror is a perfect example. The U.S. government has a long, illustrious history of using these techniques, and they keep using them because they work.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall he had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war. One can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why? We can do a variety of things if we wish to increase the pressure. I'm not advocating that, but I'm just suggesting that this is not a either-or proposition of, it's just sanctions has to succeed or other things. We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.
The United States has been trying to get Iran under its thumb for a long time. In 1953, the CIA and the UK's MI6 organized a coup to topple the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. They then installed the Shah as their puppet. The Shah, who just also happened to be a brutal dictator, ruled until 1979, when he was overthrown during the Iranian Revolution. The US didn't like that, so they tried to take Iran down by arming and funding Saddam Hussein against the Iranians. This was during the Iranian-Iraq War, which is also sometimes referred to as the First Persian Gulf War, which lasted from 1980 to 1988. The U.S. continued its support for Iraq even though they knew full well that he was using chemical weapons against the Iranians. This now declassified top-secret memo from November 4, 1983, documents chemical weapons used by Iraq and discusses Iran's likely reactions. Here's a second memo written on February 24, 1984 to the Director of Central Intelligence, predicting that Iraq will use nerve agents against Iran. Note that the source of these documents is Foreign Policy magazine, which is an extremely pro-establishment publication by any standards. In spite of this, friendly diplomatic relations between the US and Saddam continued. This video of Donald Rumsfeld, then Special Envoy of President Ronald Reagan, meeting with Saddam was taken on December 20th, 1983, which was after the first memo. This means that those running the US knew Saddam was killing people with poison gas, and they didn't care. Taking down Iran was more important to the US government than protecting human rights, and it still is. Saddam failed to defeat Iran, so the US switched tactics, and for a long time they tried to go after Iran directly by accusing them of building nuclear weapons in order to justify military strikes. However, this line of worn-out propaganda didn't gain any traction, largely because the US government had lost most of its credibility in their trumped-up claims about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. You can only cry wolf so many times before people start rolling their eyes. Their agenda fell apart completely when elements within the CIA and Mossad came forward stating that there was no evidence that Iran even intended to build such a weapon. Not to be deterred by little details like the truth, these chicken-hawk neocons decided to go after Syria to get to Iran. They know that Syria and Iran have a mutual defense agreement, and if NATO forces enter Syria, Iran will be drawn into the fight. And then these little deranged psychopaths in suits will get their war. We still have to maintain appearances, though. We wouldn't want people to think that this is about controlling the world's oil supply and protecting the petrodollar, would we? No, put those crazy conspiracy theories out of your mind. We're here to spread democracy and freedom and to protect human rights with 50 caliber machine guns and drone strikes. If it were obvious that the US was attacking Syria, it would be very difficult to obtain international or domestic support. So rather than attacking Syria directly, the US and NATO have been running a proxy war by arming and funding the Syrian rebels. To obscure the source of this support, US allies in the region such as Qatar and Saudi Arabia have been used to purchase weapons, then route them to Syria via Turkey. This pattern of arming and funding dictators or extremist groups to get them to take down non-cooperative governments has been a key element in America's foreign policy ever since the creation of the CIA after World War II.
We also have a history of kind of moving in and out of Pakistan. I mean, let's remember here, the people we are fighting today, we funded 20 years ago.
Well, let's not just talk about this in a general sense. Who was running that operation?
U.S. National Security Advisor Brzezinski flew to Pakistan to set about rallying resistance. He wanted to arm the Mujahideen without revealing America's role. On the Afghan border near the Khyber Pass, he urged the soldiers of God to redouble their efforts.
We know of their deep belief in God, and we are confident that their struggle will succeed. That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes, your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
Just in case you're thinking that this is irrelevant to our current situation, we should point out that Zbigniew Brzezinski is an acknowledged friend and mentor to Barack Obama.
He has proven to be an outstanding friend and somebody who I've learned an immense amount from. And for him to support me in this campaign and then be willing to come out here to Iowa is a testimony to his generosity. So if everybody could please give Dr. Brzezinski another round of applause.
History proves that these dictators and extremists that the US government installs are disposable, and the very qualities that made them useful against enemies are later used to demonize them, thereby providing the justification for a full-on invasion. This should be taken as a warning to those rebel groups that the US is using to destabilize Syria right now. Now, who are these Syrian rebels? This Free Syrian Army that the US government so vocally supports? Well, while the West has tried to paint them as local freedom fighters, the reality is that the conflict has attracted foreign jihadists from multiple countries, many of whom openly declare their intent to replace Assad's secular government with Sharia law. Numerous mainstream reports are already surfacing of Sharia-motivated atrocities committed by the rebels. These reports are backed up by video footage that's far too graphic for me to show here. If you do a Google search, you can find videos of men being beheaded and women being shot. Yet the US government isn't deterred by these details. They still want these extremists to topple the Syrian government. Funny, isn't it, how they require FBI background checks to buy a deer rifle in the States? But if you're a foreign jihadist trying to overthrow a government that Washington isn't on good terms with, they'll send you rocket launchers and heavy artillery with no questions asked. And how do you reconcile the fact that the US is fighting religious extremists in Afghanistan, calling them terrorists, while supporting those same groups in Syria, calling them freedom fighters? It doesn't make sense at all if you take the US government's propaganda at face value. On March 19, 2013, sarin gas was used in Syria near Aleppo. Israel and the US promptly blamed the Syrian government for the attacks, even though many of those who were killed were Syrian government soldiers. Obama began talking about the event as a red line that had been crossed, and the warmongers began their saber-rattling in earnest. However, the UN insisted on investigating the issue themselves, and on May 6, 2013, UN investigator Carla Del Ponte went public stating that evidence from their investigation indicated that it was the Syrian rebels who had used the sarin gas, and that there was no indication that the Syrian government had launched any chemical attacks whatsoever. Russia's UN ambassador Vitaly Churkin agreed with Del Ponte after Russian experts visited the location where the projectile struck and took their own samples of the material from the site. Those samples were then analyzed at a Russian laboratory certified by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. According to the lab results, they found that the presence of hexogen, utilized as an opening charge, and which is not used in standard chemical munitions, pointed to the attack being launched by the rebels. Rather than cover this development, the mainstream media did what they always do when they don't want the public to look at something. They simply changed the subject. Now, of course, the fact that the US-backed rebels had attempted to frame the Syrian government in order to build support for a NATO invasion would be bad enough. They were trying to start a war of aggression. But let's remember that sarin gas was in fact used, and the United States is supporting those who used it. That makes them an accomplice. You would think that the US would withdraw its support after such an event, but it didn't. In fact, it increased it. In July, the US began openly discussing, quote, kinetic strikes against Syria, as if their lies hadn't been exposed. This, of course, brings us to the attack on August 21st, 2013, where they attempted once again to frame the Syrian government for the use of sarin gas, and once again, they got caught. The first wave of media coverage tried to pin the attack on the Syrian government, and the US and France instantly came out condemning Assad. By August 24th, the Pentagon had already announced plans for missile strikes. But even as they did, their story was already falling apart. The Syrian army came forward that same day with footage to back up their report that they had uncovered a massive chemical weapons cache in rebel tunnels in the Damascus suburb of Jobar. This is the exact neighborhood where the chemical attack took place. Then witnesses came forward with this video footage showing the rebels preparing what appears to be crude chemical weapons rockets for an attack. If you look closely at these rockets, you'll see that the device shown is clearly improvised. This isn't a mass-produced military-grade munition like Assad would have. This is homemade. Reuters acknowledges in this article that photos of rockets matching the description in this clip are currently being examined by experts. These experts say that the rockets in the pictures that they have are, quote, relatively basic with crude stabilizing fins. They also say that they, quote, bear a striking resemblance to devices found elsewhere in Syria in the aftermath of much smaller suspected attacks, end quote. If that's the case, and if the UN and Russia have evidence that the rebels were the ones who were behind the first chemical weapons attacks back in March, then what does that tell us? Let's put this case together as a district attorney might when deciding who to prosecute for a crime. Let's establish motive, means, opportunity, and evidence. These are the elements you need to reach a guilty verdict in a court. Who had motive? Not the Syrian government. The Syrian military has been making strong gains this past few months. They didn't need to use chemical weapons. Furthermore, they knew full well that the US and NATO were looking for any excuse to invade, so the last thing that they would want to do is give them that excuse. The rebels, on the other hand, do have motive, since they knew that they could count on the Western media to spin the story in their favor. And that's exactly what's happened. But did the rebels have the means and the opportunity? Actually, yes, they did. On May 31st, 2013, security forces in Turkey found a 2-kilogram cylinder filled with sarin gas after searching the homes of Syrian militants. On July 7th, the Syrian army went public about a chemical lab that they had found belonging to rebels in the city of Banias. In terms of evidence, everything that has been released to the public so far points to the rebels being behind the attack. If the US government has any real evidence to support their side of the story, why don't they produce it? The so-called intel document that they released on August 30th to justify their position doesn't contain any evidence at all. It's just a statement of opinion. They're talking about bombing a nation, taking us into a war that will most likely spin out of control, drawing in Iran, Russia, and China, just based on their word. Both Russia and China have openly sided with Syria and Iran, and Russia has warned that thermonuclear war could result if the US continues down this path. We're talking about World War III here. This is not a game, people.
killing